This is the third stage of my Girl in the Rainforest watercolour on Bockingford watercolour paper. I'm using Winsor & Newton Artist Quality watercolour pan paints in the enamel travel kit box. It's a very convenient box, not just for travel, but even in my studio. It's a good size to fit in a video so that you can see all the paints that I'm working with. I'm working only with a very limited palette. I've mainly used the lemon yellow, ultramarine blue and the cadmium red dark. I used a little viridian green early in the piece, and I've gone into a little bit of the cadmium yellow rather than the cadmium lemon for some highlights in the middle distance. I've been gradually building up my darks, starting off very light and progressing through to the dark. Remembering the paint sinks into the paper with watercolour paint, so you put the paint in and you think it's dark and it fades off, you build up another layer. It's also allowing me to get a lot of aerial perspective into this because I'm doing one layer, transparent layer of paint over a previous transparent layer of paint, so you can see some of the foliage through behind layers that I put on top, which helps achieve depth. Because it's a rainforest, I'm needing to have some intense darks into this work so that you can get the feeling of the bright sparkling lights on the water and coming through the canopy. You only get about 15% of the lights through the canopy of a rainforest. Of course, where it's open for a stream, where the canopy opens a little wider, you'll get more light streaming through. Working with 250 gram paper, which is only lightweight paper, so it's handy to sort of have a clip to clip it down, and I've got basically a rubber band around my drawing board at the bottom holding the lower section of the paper down. Doing a little bit of splashing, but covering the area that I don't want splattered, the girl's dress. I'm not mixing on the palette as I've explained in the previous sessions. I'm trying to do my mixing on the painting itself. Working with the natural hairs, the pure sable in this case, I can get a more graceful dancing around of the paint than I would if I was working with a synthetic brush. The Winsor & Newton Series 7 number 7 brush would be an exquisite brush to do this with. It would be worth the investment if you can get hold of one. You'll tend to find that a brush like that will go on special about once a year. So if you keep tracks on any supplier who is distributing very high quality pure sable brushes, the Pettigrew Pearl mop brush or the pure Kolinsky sable for the smaller and pointed brush. Now I'm actually using the Kolinsky brand, but the Winsor & Newton Series 7 is well known and well recognized. So if you can't get a lovely pointed Kolinsky, there are many brands that will do the job. Neef is another one that puts out a very good quality pointed sable. I've done a test video showing several of them in use. This is one that I like. It's not a pure round handle. It's got flattened areas, and that's excellent for gripping. Also, if you're a little bit older or you're younger and you're just a little bit clumsy, having a brush that's got flattened sides, it does allow you to grip that brush so much better than a round brush. And that's one of the reasons why I like the Kolinsky in this particular design. Not all Kolinsky brushes will have a flattened, sectioned brush, a hexagonal shape. But this particular one has, and it's well worth paying the cost for a good brush because really you've got it for a lifetime if you look after it. Never dropped a hair. Used it for decades. wanting that girl to stand out, and I don't want to do it by detailing her up. I'm doing it by contrast of light and shade. Putting shadow in behind will make her stand out. And of course, as the foliage stretches out past the density of the inner shrub, it will pick up more light. And I scrumble. That's what that's called, rolling the brush around. I'm not doing it in a way that will damage my brush. I'm just literally rolling it fairly lightly. Not putting any pressure on the brush, not mangling the hairs, just scrumbling it. And I'm working on dry paper. Again, this always makes me have a little bit of a chuckle. Watched a YouTube artist who proudly is self-taught teaching, and one of the things she taught was that dry brushwork was lazy. It does pay to learn from somebody who's done some training. There's nothing lazy about dry brushwork. Oh dear. When you work on watercolour, you need to learn to work wet into wet, wet paint onto semi-dry paper, and then wet paper onto dry paper. And of course, then you need to work with more pigment on the brush, so the brush is becoming drier. And again, you can do that dry brush work onto wet paper, you can do it onto semi-wet paper, and you can do it onto dry paper. So you go through learning to do all these techniques. There isn't one of them that's lazy. It's a case of learning to master the different techniques. And every one of those techniques has its purpose for your painting. There is never one way to paint. You have to look at the painting and say, how does this scene need to be painted? That's why I don't give you a colour scheme and say you must have these colours. When you're doing the painting, you look at the painting and you allow that painting, that subject, to speak to you and to tell you how it wants to be painted. There isn't a formula. There isn't a formula on how to paint a tree. Anybody who came to me for lessons so that I would teach them how to paint a tree, unless I could open their mind to wanting to learn to see light and shade and shape and learn colour harmony and composition and all of those things, unless they could realise that it's not a case of learning how to paint a tree, it's a case of learning to see the subject that you're painting and paint what you see, which will vary with everything that you set out to paint, then there really wasn't any point in me teaching them, and I more or less told them so. I can't teach everybody. I am not the right teacher for everybody. I'm the right teacher for somebody who really wants to learn how to paint what they see. And you get that ability, that gives you fantastic confidence as an artist. It means that you will be able to paint anything. Anything you can see, you'll be able to paint. And what fun is that? You know, somebody comes along and says, can you paint my cat? You can say, well, I can paint your cat. You mightn't want to paint your cat, and you might say so, but you'll know that you can because you've learned to paint what you see. That's one of the reasons why it's a good idea for artists doing any art medium to watch the videos about other art mediums. For instance, I'm more likely to give a lot of light and shade and tonal lessons in my oil painting tutorials. If you go back into the files on my oil painting tutorials, you'll find a lot of light and shade lessons. And those lessons will be incredibly valuable to you, even if you're a watercolourist. You mightn't want to work in oils, but by going through those lessons, you can still learn a great deal. All lessons on composition, light and shade, colour harmony will apply, regardless of what the medium is that you're working with. But when you're working in watercolour, you have to focus so much on the mastery of the water itself, because the water is doing so much of the work and you're having to focus on controlling the water. You're really not focusing on learning all those other things that are far easier to learn when you are working with a medium that isn't going to move when you put it down. When you put watercolor down on the paper, it changes. It's changing as you watch it. You don't really know exactly what is going to happen with it, so you've got to keep your eye closely on it. So it's not such a good medium for learning the basics of painting. You actually can become a better quality, a better standard watercolor quite often if you learn the fundamentals of painting in a medium that stays still where you put it. Even if it's just working with charcoal in black and white, practice work, so that you can take what you learn from a medium that stays where you put it into your watercolor. So watercolor is one of the hardest mediums there is to learn, because you're dealing with this paint that's changing, which is exciting, but it means you're concentrating on the paint and you can tend to forget to focus on those lessons of light and shade, color harmony, composition, and all of those other things. So I would do recommend that you follow all of the tutorials, even if you're sticking with only the transparent watercolors in your painting. We've come to the end of this session. It will be continued, and thank you for purchasing this lesson or being a patron and respecting my copyright and not sharing. Thank you.